and to promote the communication between academic researchers, policy makers, policy advisors, people from civic society organizations, and the business community concerning questions related to international migration and the integration of migrants in the host society. And what we basically hope is that by exchanging that information, that better policies will be developed, and better means to the advantage of the migrants, to the advantage of the sending countries and the receiving countries. This webinar is one of the first of a long series of webinars, and this one is organized in collaboration with the Moroccan Institute for Advanced Study. I would like to give the opportunity to the director of IMEA, of the Moroccan Institute, Abdellatif Bouaza, to very quickly say a few words about the Institute. Abdellatif, please, floor is yours.
Thanks, dear John, dear colleagues and participants. Excuse my speaking, I must improve my speaking. I speak French and Arabic, but I do efforts to improve my speaking in English. It's a great opportunity for me to be with you, and I thank a lot my colleague and friend Jan and Lauren for their efforts to organize this important event. And secondly, I thank also the speakers coming from USA, South Africa, and Denmark for their acceptation to animate this event. And I thank finally the participants for their trust and encouragement. DMIA is newly created by Mohammed V University in 2019, January 2019. And the main mission of the Institute is to promote or contribute to promote the excellence in scientific research, especially in social and human sciences. And particularly, we focus our research in 3 or 4 fields. One, education and culture and arts. The second one is social transformation in Moroccan societies and in the world. And third field is economic transformation and sustainable development. And we have a transversal field, which is gender questions, digitalizations, etc., etc. So we invite the renowned and excellent research like Jan to stay here in Morocco. We, with this difficult circumstance, pandemic crisis, unfortunately, we have lockdown and our airports are locked down. We can't have researchers, but we hope to have soon Jan in September or October here in Morocco, and we invite all colleagues from UK, from Denmark, from France, etc. And we hope to have our researchers in September and October. Another time, thank you for these organizations, and we have a great pleasure to be with you and to organize this event in partnership with Metropolis International. Thank you, Jan, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Lauren, who will be the chair this afternoon. He is with Wits University and the University of Oxford. Lauren.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you, Abdellatif, for hosting us, and thank you all for joining us. Now, these are our presenters who I'll turn to just now. As you will have seen from the announcement of this seminar, our interest is with both of these is to really think about African migration in ways that are both fresh and that break from some of the debates that have been taking place, which very much focus on efforts to control African migration and the humanitarian crises associated with migration, the deaths in the Mediterranean, the detentions, all of which are clearly part of the story, but there is much more. And I think that we need to think about migration within the continent, for example, the way in which African states are also responding to migration, and particularly to think about migrants themselves. What is it that people who move within Africa are seeking to accomplish? What are the obstacles they face? How do they overcome it? How do we restore or insert their interests, their aspirations, their hopes into the story, recognizing that these are not inseparable from problems, from challenges, from crises, but they're also part of the same kind of things that affect all of us. Hope, a desire to do well for our family, a desire to do well for ourselves and our community, a desire to move forward with the projects of our lives as we define it. So we've asked 3 people to join us. We're going to go in a slightly different order, an order that we've agreed on, but we haven't yet made public. So we'll start with Lionel Nzamba, who is with the UCLG, working on local government in Africa. In some ways, he, in his work, brings together 2 very important themes. Up until recently, he has worked largely on issues of migration and developing kind of local authorities' responses to migration, something that has been more or less successful across the continent, well done in some places and not so well done in South Africa, for example, where I've been based, but is now in Morocco, if I understand correctly, and is working much more on questions of youth and trying to bring together Africa's very youthful population with questions of local government, but also, of course, with mobility. So he will speak first for 10 minutes. We'll then move to Abdoulaye Khan, who is a professor from University of Florida, a migrant himself, who's from Senegal originally, if I'm right, and has worked extensively on sort of connections between the diaspora, the Senegalese diaspora, and people back in Senegal. Among many other things that he's done, he's edited 2 books on African migration patterns and perspectives, medicine, mobility, and power in global Africa, both with Indiana University, and has another book section on the move, urbanization, migration, and nationalism. So, and they go on. So if there's anyone who's more qualified to speak about African migration, that'd be hard to find. If there is someone, it might be Naya Kleist, who's a researcher with the Danish Institute of International Affairs, someone I've known for a long time, whose research also focuses, of course, on mobility, belonging, and social order. So she works much more from a kind of ethnographic or anthropological perspective, looking at how migration is perceived, practiced, and governed by different actors. She's worked extensively on sort of the Somali diaspora, so the other side of the continent, and questions of humanitarian crisis, questions of climate change. But perhaps what's most important, and part of why we invited her here today, is that she's just co-edited a book, which is exciting, and I encourage you to get, entitled Hope and Uncertainty in Contemporary African Migration. So again, no one better to speak about questions of aspiration, questions of hope, and questions of mobility. So you didn't come to hear me, you didn't come to hear Jan, so you came to hear our speakers. So what I'll do is I'll turn it over now, Lionel, if you're ready. I will mute myself, but at about 8 minutes, you'll start seeing me wave gently, which is a sign that you've got 2 minutes left to go. So please keep to time if you can. And then if you have questions as the speakers are presenting, if you'd like to make comments, I believe everyone should have access to the chat. You can direct a question either directly to me or to Jan as the hosts, and we will kind of try to address those and redirect them during the discussion to the speakers, or you can ask them to the whole group. But of course, then at the risk that they may get a little lost if a lot of people feel that they want to engage. But either way, we'll try to get to everyone and make it as participatory as possible. We've got about an hour left to go. So half of that spent with the speakers and half of it spent in the discussion. So if I can, Lionel, let me hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today about dreams and trajectory. So my communication will be on migrant ambition tested by African City Challenge. While we was preparing this this session, the organizer give us keywords to address this this issue. It was hope, aspiration, motivation, and dream. So you know these words are possible only in a city. And talk about dreams and trajectory of African migrants is talk about the city where this dreams comes through. And now is now accepted that African migration is primarily internal. It means that African migrants mainly stay in a please excuse me, mainly stay in a continent. The reality wants that people, migrants, migrate from a city to another city. This reality make African city a full-fledged migration actors. It means that there are stakeholders in a migration with their own strategy, their assets, but also challenges. Local authority trying to overcome this challenge, and there is a lot of challenge that that is possible and that can be has a fence for migrants. Local authority, the location of cities, the wealth, the opportunity they offer, or the living environment in that cities provide for people are much reason for attracting the newcomer in the city, as for keeping away those new arrival in the city. And you know, the fact that the city is attractive mobilize state, because in this way, some national government show their hostility to migrants, and in the other way, the city are showing their solidarity with the situation of migrants. And you see, there is a lot of municipal movements around migration, like the adoption of some charter who promotes the city rights of migrants in Africa mostly, to support migrants in Africa and national association or civil society organization that support migrants. And when I talk about the hostility of state against migrant or migration, it's traduced in some discourse that criminalize migration, or some acts that showing that migrants are discriminated. So maybe it's about their statute. I talk about the legal statute. If they are irregular if they are irregular, I talk about the administrative situation, and this condition make them a kind of deny the right. For example, the right for education, the housing, of work. In the searching of better working and living condition, people are fleeing for war, for bad condition, they're fleeing for persecution in the cities, and the host city have also some difficulty that migrant meets when they arrive. And this situation provide, for example, the main challenge that have been raised by most of researchers, like rapid urbanization. It's bring urban insecurity, human traffic or exploitation, or the xenophobia or racism. So this bad management bring by the city who don't care about newcomer or migrant show all the bad in migration. So this is why some countries develop what I called in the beginning a sort of solidarity that promotes the inclusion of migrants by give them the access to work, and or promoting some countries, for example, if I take the case of Morocco, some countries promotes the fact that bringing migrant, I think about student, bringing migrant can develop some countries. If you take the example of a country of a city in Morocco, calling Mohammedia. Mohammedia, since 10 years I'm living in Morocco, I show this city is changing by hosting a certain type of migrant, student, for example. They bring a certain life in this city, and actually the city become more and more important than in the past. So, yeah, so we need for migrants to allow them to realize their dream. We need some politic that take in consideration the aspiration, the skills that can facilitate the inclusion in the city. Because what people need to be included in the city is a job or a social situation. But if those conditions are not guaranteed by a city or by a state, we are going to promote communitarism or radicalism, and this is the main difficulty that we can see in Europe or in some country in Africa. And when I was talking about the rapid urbanization, we view the first experience of migrants is when they go to the vulnerable neighborhood, and we give them several names like slums, like ghetto, barrios, or favela. These are the condition who promotes bad intention even from migrant, but from citizen. So we need to construct, we need to sharp cities with some politics that can include young people to avoid this bad way of life. So continuing on the fact that some country promote the arrival of new kind of migrant.
Lionel, sorry, can I just ask you to wrap up if you can?
Yeah. Okay. So I want just to conclude with my short presentation, is that we don't there are two things that can be avoided with inclusion of migrant in the city. So we need to reinforce the role of locality, to give them the opportunity to shape the city, to allow them to make a better situation for the citizen to make possible a migrant to be a citizen and an active key player in the city. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lionel. I mean, I hear so much in what you're saying about, one, the need to concentrate on movement within Africa. Also a recognition that, you know, that there's stigma and there's some response to African migration in some places, even within African countries, that it is not, that it is universally welcome, but that moving beyond that can help cities transform and can transform in positive ways. And really engaging with migrants and engaging with their aspirations can help cities to not only become more important, but to help avoid some of the things that we often associate with migration, the slums, the potential violence, the social exclusion. But that really requires a reframing of migration and a willingness to see it as a natural, positive thing that's connected to people's lives at multiple levels. So thank you for that, Lionel. We'll certainly be coming back to you as the discussion continues. I see Abdullah has already started getting his PowerPoint up and ready for us. So as soon as that is going, I'll start his clock for 10 minutes. And again, we'll interrupt you if with 2 minutes left. All right, Abdullah, can I turn to you? You're still muted, so we can only see your nice presentation.
Yeah, hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to share with you some few thoughts about mostly the theme of aspirations. And I'll be focusing on youth imaginaries and migration, and how it is important to look at youth imaginaries in order to understand motivations and aspirations of youth migration in Africa.
Can I, sorry, before you continue, can I just ask you to turn this into a presentation so that we can, it makes the text a bit bigger. If you can start it as a slideshow.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, the common aspirations of African youth, and I would say that migration is really a default option. I would mention some of the common aspirations that you would find among African youth. But before that, the objective of migration, the way in the narratives of African migrants one can make sense of it, is really about this notion of tekki in Wolof, which, you know, for the Senegalese, it means really to becoming someone important in society, to have a dignified life and to be respected. And this idea that you better be the hands that gives rather than the hands that receives. So it's really about this notion of, you know, being, having a meaningful life in society. So the common trajectories of success among African youth, you know, some of it you might already know, and it might be actually prevalent across Africa. Football, you know, aspiring to become a professional soccer player in Europe. You know, that's a child dream for a lot of African youth. In Senegal in particular, wrestling has become really popular and people are making a lot of money. So it becomes also another ways of, you know, for the youth to aspire to become wrestlers. Music is another area. A lot of people aspiring to become famous musicians or DJs. And more recently, you have the aspirations to become an actor or comedian in the growing TV series industry. You have also that kind of path to success. The other thing is long studies and politics. You have, of course, for young people who are ambitious and who want to do long studies, that's another option, but it's always kind of understood as, needed to be connected to politics. You have to become, if you want to be successful, you have to enter in politics. So when all of those chances fail, you take a road and you become a global nomad. You leave, to move, and you move to live. That's really kind of the idea of migrations as a default option, right? Although some of the options I mentioned, like soccer play, it's also some forms of movement, of course. The motivation and how migrants imagine their destinations. In a documentary, Dollar Dreams, West African migrants in New York City talks about, how they imagined America before coming and how they found New York City when they arrived. And they narrated their disillusionment, after finding how hard it was to, live and work in New York City. And so that's something that, is always true for migrants, the way they kind of imagine their destination and how they go through disillusionment when they arrive. I wouldn't kind of expand on that. There is a song by two Ivorians, Petit Yode and L'Enfant Siro, talking about Paris as is hard like a rock. Paris est dur comme caillou. But the whole song is really about how it is difficult for African migrants to live and work in Paris. So nowadays you have immigrants who are returning home and talking about their living conditions and working conditions and trying to discourage others to migrate. You have government officials, you have international NGOs, all trying to warn people about the difficulty of life and in these ideal destinations. Why, despite all that information, African youths are still trying to cross borders for better future? And it's really, to answer that question, you have really to look at the sources of youth imaginary of places of destinations, which are not only in Europe or North America. They also include capital cities for rural urban migrants or neighboring African countries. So let me just explore some of these sources of these youth imaginary. Okay?
Right, you've got about three or four minutes left, if you don't mind.
Okay, so I will be summarizing it. So the idea is really images speaks louder than words. And the image is conveyed by, let's say, successful African migrants returning home are very important for this youth imaginary, right? Somebody coming back, building a house where you used to stand a mud house, for example, building a concrete house, getting married and kind of spending money without counting for, family ceremonies, having praise singers kind of come and, sing your praises. So there is this idea that migrants, engage in a spending spree when they come back home, and the youth are looking at that, and it becomes like this is the something that I can become if I just, I'm able to cross borders and get a chance that they got to go and work in a foreign country. And you can see these kind of lavish homes that are built in the Senegal River Valley villages. Clearly, these are kind of powerful images of success that, the youth are looking at in their efforts to kind of find, paths to success. You have marriages, people spending a lot of money in marriages, and for the youth, the cost of marriage is becoming more and more, marriages are becoming costly, and so you have need to mobilize a lot of resources, and that requires, of course, for them going abroad and doing like these migrants. One of the other thing is like migrants, women returning home to marry their daughters. They oftentimes throw the most lavish marriages, and they spend, endless money. And most of this is really money they saved for years, and they are willing just to go to spend it and show that they have been successful. To just conclude, I would say, no matter how much we talk about the living conditions and the difficulties in the migration roads, it would not stop people from going, as long as they would see that migration can be transformative in the life of migrants, in the life of their families left behind. Clearly, having a migrant in one family make a huge difference and can lift out, families out of poverty. And so all of those images are, speaking louder than the words that people are, using to try to convince young people to stay in put. And that's only valid for North migration. We talked about internal and intra-African migrations. Clearly, you have the similar kind of behavior from migrants returning from Central Africa to Senegal, for example. They engage exactly in the same, attitude of showing that they have been successful, building houses and spending in family ceremonies. That's what kind of frame these youth imaginaries and how they kind of are willing to, do everything to participate in migration. I think I would stop there. I might have been a little bit over time, but yeah.
Thank you, Abdullah. You're only a minute over time, which is wonderful because it'll keep things moving. I mean, thank you all for the presentation and the images. It also helps to see things. I would have loved to see some pictures of the wrestling. I can only imagine what Senegalese wrestling is like, if it has any of the color and the performance of Senegalese music and other art forms. But I think, part of what I'm really taking from your presentation is the way in which over multiple generations, mobility becomes part of the process of maturation, part of becoming a person, as you say, in the community. It is connected to becoming, to becoming an adult, to becoming a provider, to becoming, not for everyone, but it is part of the story of many communities, whether that's moving to a city, whether it's moving to France. But cutting off the possibility of moving is really cutting off people's future, cutting them off from their future, but already cutting them off from the dreams, from their aspirations, and family and the diaspora, which is really part of the lived world of many communities across the continent. So with that, if I can ask you to stop sharing your screen so that we can have a look at Naya. I think she also has some images to show us, but Abdullah, I see that there are already questions in the chat if you want to reply to them about gender, for example. And I think, Lionel, you've already been responding. There's a few questions there. I'll come back. I've got some other questions that have come to me via email once we're done, and we'll open up the discussion. So thank you again, Abdullahi, and we'll come back to you in a few minutes once Naya's had her 10 minutes of fame. So Naya,
I'm trying to.
Thank you so much, Laura, and organizers and the other panelists. This is really an interesting event, and I'm happy to be here virtually. So what I will be talking about is what then if these hopes invested in migration don't work out, if migrants are deported, if they are evacuated from civil war or have to return to their countries of origin or elsewhere, what I call disruption of migration. And I'll be focusing on Ghana. So in addition to my long-term interest in Somali diaspora groups, I've also a long-term interest in Ghanaian migration since I think 2007-8. And the case study I'll be talking about here is indeed about Ghana. And I will start out by just briefly talking about what could be called a mobility paradox. So this mobility paradox forms a backdrop of, I'll say, a lot of migration today, in that on the one hand, we have images of migration, the good life elsewhere, opportunities circulating globally via international media, social media, personal networks, etc. And especially with the spread of smartphones, I mean, these images are widely available. But on the other hand, we have also a situation where access to safe and legal migration circuits, especially intercontinental migration, are not widely, are very unequal, distributed in very unequal ways because of restrictive mobility regimes, immigration policies, border control, militarization, etc. So people, potential migrants, West Africans, for instance, but also elsewhere, might have images, spectacles of wealth and life elsewhere, but not able to migrate safe and legally. And I would just like to show you a photo that I always show when I talk about this, because I think it sums it up very well. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes. So it's a photo of a Ghanaian minibus from where I did field work. And as you can see, it says KLM Airland, and it's standing next to a kiosk, the Atomic Lotto kiosk, where you can have Lucky Tuesday, Midweek Fortune, etc. So there's a lot of, in this photo, a lot of like ideas, images about the future, but also, to me, it raises the question, so you wanted to fly with KLM airline perhaps, but you ended up in the KLM Airland. So what does that mean for people? And this mobility backdrop was the point of departure for a research project that I did with two colleagues to explore, so what does that mean for West African migrants? And as I just said, my focus today and in this project was on forced return or disrupted migration projects. So what I did was to do field work in a rural town in Ghana, from where there's a lot of overland migration to Libya and further afield, and also other kinds of migration, but a lot of this kind of precarious high-risk migration. And also many cases of involuntary or forced return, such as evacuation from the civil war in Libya in 2011, and deportation, especially from Libya, but also from many other places. And this is mainly, this kind of migration is mainly undertaken by young men without much formal education. So there's a gender perspective here as well. And I'll just emphasize that this is one kind of Ghanaian migration amongst many others. Okay, so we don't need to look at that any longer. And there basically, I identified three kinds of social and migratory trajectories in this, which are volatile, interlinked, and may change over time. So these are continued precarity, remigration, and social and economic regeneration. So we'll continue precarity. When migrants are returned, deported, evacuated, they are often coming back empty-handed, having lost savings, their goods, their employment, and come back to very difficult situations. So often returnees start by hiding, quote unquote, before coming back to their hometowns, if they do so, and before facing family members. And returnees without their own household will typically stay with parents, friends, or family. They will go from being people who give to people who receive, as Abdullah just also talked about. They'll stop sending remittances, obviously, but need very often to, all their needs to be covered by other people, which is seen as very embarrassing for many people who should have, in terms of their own expectations and other expectations, been providing for their families, for their wives, children, parents, nieces and nephews, etc., rather than being people who receive. They are also often met with ridicule, suspicion from people, other townspeople in this town, and describe this situation as being very difficult and as being characterized by shame and social stigmatization. And this is also linked to collective dimensions and the fact that people who come back in this way are often coming back to either the same or worse socioeconomic situations than before they left that can be aggravated because of debt. So I'll just give you a couple of quotations to illustrate that. So one man who had been returned twice from Libya, first evacuated and then deported, he explained it like this. We did not feel happy because there was nothing in our pocket and there are no jobs here, so we were not feeling lucky. My family was not feeling well either. They were not feeling well. Even the little money I had, I have lost it. And a single mother who were one of the few women who had engaged in this overland migration and been evacuated and was in a very difficult situation. She explained it like this. I have no money, so it has all been in vain. I didn't bring back anything and I have regretted it since I came back. People gossip a lot about me. It pains me when I think about it. So in these cases, the social hope that migration is embedded in or reflects, so to speak, turn into a kind of social hopelessness, not only for migrants themselves, but also often for their families and communities, so to speak, which demonstrates the uncertainty of migration as a pathway for a better future. Then remigration is the second trajectory, because a lot of migrants or people in this area engage in several migration projects.
Just if you have 3 minutes or so.
Okay, so about of the 45 return migrants I talked to, more than half of them had been deported or evacuated several times. So it's very usual to engage in several overland migration projects, which of course also tells us that the idea that if only we tell migrants how dangerous it is to migrate, they won't do it, because obviously when you've done it once, you know what it's about. So these kinds of multiple remigration projects are very common, and they show us the normality of this kind of mobile livelihood rather than reflections of a specific kind of risk-prone behavior or lack of knowledge. And it also shows us that if people are deported, it's not the end of the so-called migration cycle. So the third trajectory is socioeconomic regeneration. And one of the really interesting things about doing fieldwork over a longer period of time or repeated fieldwork is to follow how people do as years pass by. So in this case, fieldwork was over 3 years, 3 times. So some people did manage to go through socioeconomic regeneration to establish themselves or reposition themselves in respectable positions. Perhaps they had managed to send back remittances or invest. Perhaps they had some skills they could draw upon. Perhaps a family situation helped them do so. So in these cases, they might actually succeed in embodying to a certain degree, or at least do okay after a while and resemble images of successful migration, maybe not the beautiful houses that Abdullah showed, but still something. So these different trajectories show us, I mean, that this can go in many different directions. So to conclude this short intervention, one of the findings that struck me from this study was that there was a kind of individualization of success and failure, quote unquote, of migration projects and of return. Because even though to a large degree that the structural constraints and risks of migration is widely known, returnees often expressed that they had this sense of being individualized, that they were seen as not having, that it was their own because of lack of discipline or perhaps because of bad luck, rather than blaming like the structural circumstances and mobility regimes that I had expected people would be furious about. But on a more analytical level, I suggest that we can understand that as a way to hang on to the social repository of migration and hope, that if you stick to this idea that it is possible to succeed, and indeed some people do succeed, there's still this overall pathway of migration as a way to a better or more dignified life. Thank you.
Thank you, Naya. As for everyone else, I'm sure there's clapping happening on mute, which you just can't hear. I mean, listening to you, I mean, I was struck throughout the presentation of the aptness of the kind of atomic lotto of the riskiness, and not just in the physical sense, but that you stepping into a migration space is also stepping into an unknown. And if we build it as this sense of it is linked to becoming, but it's not always clear what it is that you will become or how you will get there, and that the kind of futures are uncertain. And I think in some ways, for someone who studies African migration, it's also quite brave to highlight the kind of failures and the frustrations. We're often afraid, we often celebrate migration as something that delivers development, it delivers on, and to recognize that often that's not the case. Sometimes that's not the case because of restrictions that you just mentioned and violence, but sometimes it's not the case in the way that finding work, sometimes we don't get it. Sometimes we don't get the job. Sometimes things just don't work out the way we expected. And that makes people reevaluate and their hopes and their shifts and their orientations towards the world also shift. So I just want to thank you. I want to thank all three of you. There's already questions you'll see in the chat. I've got a few by email, which I'll just read out. If you have questions, you can either send them in the chat. If you'd really like to speak, you can raise your hand, I believe, and I'll try to call you. There's 60-something people here, so I may not see you immediately, so the chat might be safer. And then we'll come back to the speakers and let them respond, to the questions that they feel like they can. We don't have too much time for back and forth, but hopefully we will hear from everyone. So to Lionel, the sort of questions I have, I'm reading them here on my other screen, about whether you could speak a little bit of the variations you see, about why certain cities are responding positively and others don't. You mentioned some of the kind of political aspects and the political solidarities, but how do we explain that? And also, I guess in this day and age, how do you even think about what a city is with this kind of high levels of mobility? Is a city one nicely bound thing, or is it in fact this kind of almost an urban diaspora itself, where you're thinking about people living these translocal lives that change the very nature of what cities do? As for Abdullah, I guess there's been questions that are about, I think Julia, I don't know how to pronounce your name, has asked about, a shift. What is shifting? Or there seems to be a shifting of aspiration from a kind of global to a more local. Is that happening? Is that something that you see? Also, what are the reasons for the particular trajectories? Is it colonial legacies? Is it do you think it's television? Is it TikTok? What is it that continues? You talked about the images. How are those circulating? How do they interact with people's aspirations? And also to build on some of the kind of comments that Naya was making, the story that you're telling was quite gendered, often very focused on men. Do you see more women following in that, or is there a sort of different set of aspirations for women who might move? And perhaps potentially a different set of stigma for women who move and might leave families, might leave caring responsibilities. And I would just ask tonight, also building on the comment I had before around how do we use the kind of more nuanced sort of approach that you're suggesting, this kind of recognition of hope, but also the recognition that migrants themselves often blame themselves for this, to further some of the discussions in Europe where you're based around African migration, to try to at once naturalize it. We want to see it as a positive thing, as a natural thing, but it also comes with risks. It also comes with concerns. It's also, there are social pressures on all sides. How do we use that in engaging with those discussions more publicly? So maybe at this point, continue to welcome questions, and we'll come back to questions from the audience, but maybe we can just go very quickly, and I'll ask you, you don't have to respond to everything, just respond to what you can in 3 or 4 minutes each, and then we'll go for a second round. So I'll just follow the same order, and Lionel, turn to you.
Thank you. First of all, we have to know that Morocco developed a strategy, national strategy on migration and asylum. And we know that local authority in Morocco didn't wait for this national strategy, but the fact that the state allow every actor in the migration governance to make positive action have boosted the action of the civil society to promote some activity that make migrants more confident in being Morocco. So I want to share, to illustrate and to respond to one question about the aspiration of women. I want to share this picture with you. So you see, the first picture, you see these young people. This picture was taken in north of Morocco in the territory of Melilla. And what I wrote here is, if you look up young people, he will try to go out. But if you give him the freedom of movement, he will bring you money. So this is very simple. If you allow people, a woman or a man, a young man or a young woman, to be mobile, to go in another city to find himself, it will bring positive things for the city and for the country. So this can resume the opportunity that city can provide, and I hope that African country will follow the example of Morocco. It's the only country that organized a general legalization of migrants. Of course, it was under some condition, but it's the only country in Africa and maybe in the world that allowed the legalization of illegal migrants. So this is the point that I want to highlight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lionel. Let me, that's very interesting. I mean, it's sort of what you're saying is in some ways in stark contrast to Naya's presentation about people don't always come back with money, and sometimes the inability to do so, whatever the reason, goes against that expectation that if someone has left, they should come back with the bag of cash that we saw there, and that also adds a challenge and a dimension. I'm sure that's something Abdullahi has also witnessed.
I think,
but let me turn to you,
I think,
Abdullahi.
okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you for your questions. I've seen a very interesting ones in the chat as well. So the story I'm telling is really, this focus on the one who have been successful, but it doesn't mean that, people are not returning home empty-handed, but they don't really get the focus of these young migrants. And usually in the stories that people tell to, warn people about, trying to go on the boats, is exactly, highlighting these failure cases, but it does not really mean anything compared to what they see, around them in terms of, what migrants have accomplished and how they have lifted out their families out of poverty. So I think it's really about what people pick and choose in terms of their focus. And the youth tend to really focus on the successful. And usually when you fail is right, there is something wrong, about you. It tends to kind of, focus on individual responsibility. And people would say, how is he kind of, was he not able to make it when many others were able to be successful? For the notion of tekifi, which means, to be successful at home, it's true that there have been a lot of interesting push both by local governments in trying to respond to this process of risky migration and pointing out that there is other ways to be successful. People have been talking about farming, projects. In the Senegal River Valley, a lot of migrants associations actually taping on the money that the core development funds in France have provided, have been trying to, steer the youth towards, farming. But usually, from what I understood is, it becomes like a stepping point. It's like, you do it, in order to mobilize funds to be able to move, rather than, let's say, taking it as a viable alternative, and a viable option. And there was some other questions. What happened to people who fail? I mean, you have a lot of people who are stuck in idle destinations because they were not able to mobilize enough money to go home and show that they have been successful. And so people are reluctant to go home when they are not able to kind of fit that figure of a successful migrant. I don't know if I skipped some questions, but I would leave it to that. And
yeah, thank you, Abdullahi.
Maybe
you're also
later to other questions.
Okay, you're also freezing a little bit. I'm seeing a few more questions. So Naya, before you jump in, let me just add some more things that you might consider. There are questions about how all of these things, but particularly the COVID and the inability to move has shaped how people might see migration. Most of us have not been in the field since COVID, so we may not know how things have changed. But if you have thoughts on that, but also questions about other broader shift, sort of shifting narratives at a global level, which is kind of what we'd asked you about before. So Naya, I'll just hand to you and give you a round, and then we'll see if we have time for some final comments.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. So I think in terms of, telling about more difficult situations coming with risk, that's a point. I think what I would like to highlight here is the importance of telling many different stories and African migration is so many different things, and I think it's important to highlight all these complexity and different stories. So it's about migration and development for sure, also something that I've been working on quite a lot, but it's also about the difficulties of deportation and like the very real life implications of current mobility regimes, that this is actually happening. We cannot ignore that. There was a question in the chat about if that other group of migrants might have similar concerns in terms of making it. And I think this points also to the existential dimensions of this. So there's also a broader story of making it and showing who you are to your family, living up to expectations, whether these expectations come from yourself or from family members. So I think that's interesting to take into perspective. And I will also say for more like a nerdy perspective in terms of talking about hope. So having focus on these kind of enforced relocation or being stuck, as was mentioned before, or being deported, whatever, it also shows the ambivalence of working with a hope perspective. It's not necessarily about success or optimism, but there are these ambivalences of hoping and putting hope in migration. In terms of the COVID-19, so yeah, I've neither been to the field, but I think COVID-19 perhaps has demonstrated to many of us who are not used to having our mobility being delimited. So this is not news for a lot of people in Africa, but in Europe, for example, in Western Europe, all of a sudden, there were things that we cannot do because of restrictions. So I cannot say what it means for West African migration, but I think there's something about that, a broader attention to immobility and mobility restrictions. Thank you.
Thanks, Naya. I'm looking, and there's, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't seen, there's some questions that all of you have addressed or have seen. So I instead of trying to go for another round, I just want to give each of the speakers, unless there is someone who really wants to ask a quick question from the field, or Jan or Abdulatif, if you'd like to ask a quick, otherwise I'll ask each of the speakers just for a sort of final word on going forward. What are the sort of big questions that we should be thinking about? What is the sort of takeaway message or concern if we start thinking about African aspiration? How should we be thinking about this? How does that, in some ways it's the question we asked you at the beginning, but a very short 1 minute kind of takeaway that you'd like to leave us with. So again, I'll just go in this order, and then I'll hand it back to Abdulatif and Jan to see whether they want to say any final words. So Lionel?
Thank you to give me the floor. I think, first of all, the social media give another dimension to a success story of migration. So, and I hope that national authority will be inspired by practice of local authority, because how to just repeat what I've been said, we have to think local and act global. That will arrange the situation of a lot of migrants. This is what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's wonderful to hear the call to prayer in the background as you speak. It's an unusual sound in these parts, but it's a beautiful sound. Thank you, Lionel. Abdullahi.
I think if I were to think of something, is really to stop talking about migration in terms of crisis, but to look at more the transformative side of migration for migrants and their families and their communities. Somebody mentioned, the connection to development, and I think for somebody who works on the Senegal River Valley, migrants are doing more than the state in terms of providing for their people, building schools, health facilities, and doing a lot of things. It's not just about lifting families out of poverty, but it's also contributing to really improving living conditions in sending countries. So it's very important to look at that. And then I think we should also look at, cultures of migration versus, let's say, the new kind of trends of migrations out of African cities, which, in themselves are very problematic, but it is the result of, let's say, these more structural problems in terms of the demographics or unemployment. But there are some, very settled cultures of migrations. I think of the northern, northern Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, the border area. You have, in Burkina Faso, some parts that are also have a long history of migration, and the patterns of migration in those kind of, deep kind of historically seeded migration cultures is very different from, let's say, the other patterns. And in those communities, for example, you have legal migration continuing because people were able to become citizens in their countries of their host countries, and are helping their cousins and others to come legally and join them. So there are, still some path of legal migration within those kind of pockets of community. I think of the Soninke, for example, in France, are known to have all the French national, to become all, to naturalized, and then leave their kids back home. Those kids are all French citizens. And when they turn 18, they go to the embassy, get their passport, and go to France. So I think there are very interesting aspects that need to be looked at from that perspective, and not just look at the kind of, so-called crisis, which is, I think, a way of framing it that is coming really out from outside Africa, which is the reflect of the concern of Europeans in general and Americans when you take here in the United States, the southern border. But I think we need to look at the transformative kind of potentials of mobility and migration.
Thanks, Abdullahi. And Naya, the final word.
Yeah, I really like the focus on social transformations. In addition to that, so perhaps at a more nerdy, from a more nerdy perspective, I think that it could be really interesting and important to focus on different scales of mobility and immobility. So not only there's a tendency to de-link so-called internal migration and international migration. I think it could be very interesting to have more emphasis on how these different kinds of mobilities are linked or not linked, and have attention to immobility also. And then also to realize that migration and mobility are part of life, they're part of livelihoods, and they are not deviants or problem to be solved. So yeah, to move away also from the crisis narrative, as others have said. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all three of you. I mean, there's so much here. It's been incredibly rich. I mean, Naya, I would echo you about this kind of multiple scales, that there are multiple stories, there are multiple narratives, there are multiple experiences. But every time movement is connected to processes of transformation, not always in the ways we would like, and often in ways that lead to frustration. But I think what you've really helped us do today is also shift, as Abdullahi was asking us to do, to shift that discussion away from crisis, away from just deprivation, away from people running, but rather, as we hope to do, to think about the way in which mobility even when there is poverty involved, even when there is violence involved, even when there's persecution, is still connected to people seeking ways of empowering themselves, seeking ways to build their communities, seeking ways of opening pathways to a different future, whether that future is ultimately back where they've come from or in another part of the world. Those imaginations, those hopes are critical to how we understand what is happening and how people respond to stimulus, to restrictions, to interventions at multiple levels. So let me just say thank you from me, and then give Jan and our other host, Abdelatif, a chance to just wish you goodbye and put any final words if they wish to.
Well, thank you very much. I have three things that I quickly want to point out. First of all, this session has been recorded, and so I will make an effort to put it on the web and to share it with you. I got your email addresses, so I will ensure that you will be informed about that. Secondly, in 2 weeks' time, there will be another webinar in this series that sort of reverses the question. It's clear that one of the things that came out of this session is that we're talking about people who have hopes and dreams, and so that's sort of a far cry from the discussions about the crisis that seem to be very popular at this side of the Mediterranean. But next time we will focus on that, and particularly ask ourselves the question, what attempts have been done, successfully or not successfully, or even with perverse effects, but what attempts have been done by various governmental institutions to interfere in this process. I will again inform you about it by email, because I got your email addresses. And finally, I would like to thank a number of people. First of all, the speakers for sharing their interesting thoughts with us. For Lauren Landau for wonderfully chairing this session. For Abdelatif for giving us the opportunity to organize this. And for the participants for your contribution, and especially for those who contributed with questions in the chat box. Thank you very much. If you have any other question or comment, shoot an email and we will deal with that appropriately. But that being said, Abdelatif, is there anything you want to say by way of closing? You're muted.
Yes, thank you. Excuse me. First of all, I thank everybody, especially our speakers, for the excellence of their presentations, and our great animator, Professor Lauren, and you, Jan, for your efforts to organize this great and important event. And secondly, I will bring testimony about Moroccan approach in this area, migration, with especially African migration, which is giving results in terms of inclusion and integration of people. And we have by now children in schools, Moroccan schools. We have Africans workers, especially in Rabat and Casablanca, Marrakesh, in Tangier, in Mohammedia, etc., etc. And we hope that other countries do like Morocco in this area, in order to allow these African citizens to become our citizen. In Morocco, we consider these migrants like Moroccan people. And another time, I thank you and I give you thanks for my president, Professor Mohammed Ghashi, who is president of our university. He thank everybody for your implication and presentations, etc. Thank you, and we are happy to organize another webinars with you in the future.
Well, thank you very much. Have a great day or great night, depending on where you are. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.